Okay, good morning, everyone. Usually U of T time means starting at 10 past, but we'll start at 5 past. We need to get moving. But there might well be people trickling in thinking that we're running on U of T time. Very happy you've all made it. Welcome, all of you, to the University of Toronto and to this workshop on Minoan architecture and urbanism. We're in quite a nice seminar room, and that's because it belongs to the history department. A few floors above us is my department, the Department of Art, and our seminar room is not quite so nicely equipped. I guess we have slightly different priorities or just no money. But I thought I ought to try and explain a little bit before I hand over to Quentin to give the real sort of aims and objectives of the workshop. I thought I should give you a little bit of the history of how Bronze Age archaeology exists in the Department of Art. It's not all that common. Some of you will, of course, know, but I'll say it for the rest of you. There's a long history here of the Aegean Bronze Age being taught out of the art department, which was established in 1935 with its first chair, John Alford, devising a 4-part curriculum which was composed of ancient art, medieval, Renaissance and Baroque, and modern. And that basically continues today as the backbone of our program. And in terms of ancient art, and in particular Greek, Homer Thompson was curator of the classical collection at the Royal Ontario Museum, or ROM, between 1933 and 1947, and taught courses in ancient art as a cross-appointed professor here, before then in 1947 going on to Princeton and directing the Athenian Agora excavations. Thompson was succeeded by James Walter Graham, who also functioned as the Greek and Roman curator at the ROM from 1947 to the late 60s. And as an authority on Minoan architecture, he published in 1962 The Palaces of Crete, which remains a seminal text in the field. He retired in 1972 and was replaced by Joseph Shaw. And in 1976, with his wife, Professor Maria Shaw, and Joe and Maria are here with us today, with an international team, they began excavating the prehistoric Minoan and Greek site at Komos on the south coast of Crete, which is now very fully published. If you have it on your shelf, it takes up a good portion of it. On Shaw's retirement in 2000, an anonymous donor helped establish the Walter Graham Homer Thompson Chair in Aegean Prehistory in recognition of this strong tradition. And so Aegean prehistoric studies can continue in the Department of Art today, and I'm the lucky one to hold this chair currently. All that said, we do have strong connections with other departments. We don't have an especially strong connection with history, apart from them letting us use their room. But I do have a lab which is housed in the Department of Anthropology, and this is where Quentin is currently based whilst he's on loan from Louvain. It's also the home, the Department of Anthropology that is, to the relatively new Archaeology Centre, which serves to bring together the archaeologists that are scattered across 5 departments of the university. And it's this combination of this long art historical tradition in the study of Aegean architecture and the new interdisciplinary links between art history, archaeology, and anthropology that we think makes U of T an ideal setting for this workshop. So this is just a little bit of this background I wanted to give you, because it's certainly due in very large part to the Shaws and their students that U of T has this reputation in the Aegean world for architectural studies. I'm afraid I don't continue this tradition because I study miserable pottery sherds, I'm afraid. But I'm trying to make up for it by with this workshop on architecture and urbanism. Of course, we must thank our sponsors. We're very generously funded, thankfully, from SHIRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Fonds National de Recherche Scientifique of Belgium, and the ARC, A World in Crisis project of the Université de Louvain. So we're very grateful to those main sponsors, and of course we're also supported by the Archaeology Centre and the Art Department. Just a few housekeeping things. Hopefully all the information you need about lunch and dinner, and things like Wi-Fi access is in your packs, which have been very well put together, I think, by Quentin and one of our grad volunteers, Paula, who's at the back, who will help you out with all kinds of questions, and our other volunteers at front. Rachel here just coming in, another grad student here, and Christina out front, and I think Rachel over here will be helping out a bit as well. In your packs you should have forms which are waivers, basically, whereby you agree to be recorded, for your talk to be recorded, and for that eventually to be posted online so people who can't be here can see what you have to say afterwards, and that'll be posted out of the Louvain website. If what you have to say is not for more general consumption, then just say so on the form, and we won't put it online. It's straightforward. But if you want to agree to that, then that would be great. Now it's time for me to hand over to my co-organizer, really organizer, Quentin Letesson, who will tell you about the aims and objectives of the workshop. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. This introduction will be divided in 3 different parts. Firstly, I want to give you a broad overview of where we stand today in studies of Minoan architecture and urbanism, especially in relation with current debates in Minoan scholarship. In a second time, I'll try to explain to you what I mean by writing Minoan society spatially, and how this perspective can help us refine our understanding of Minoan towns and buildings, especially through a shift from static data to dynamic processes. And before turning the floor to the speakers, I will try to outline some of the topics and issues that we might want to discuss during these 2 days, especially in terms of limitations that could be detrimental to that shift. And I'll mainly talk about data collection and data description. Since the beginning of the 20th century, and with the large-scale excavation of Sir Arthur Evans at Kenosis, but also excavations at Cournia and Palais Castro, Minoan towns and buildings have always been considered particularly distinctive. And more specifically, they attracted a lot of attention because scholars realized that they were essentially very different from towns and buildings of Archaic and Classical Greece. Consequently, a lot of scholarly attention was focused on Minoan architecture and buildings. And as Cal said, there's a very long tradition here at the University of Toronto, of course, with James Walter Graham and Joseph Shaw. But John McEnroe did also his PhD at the University of Toronto, so it's almost a dynasty, really. During these decades, and especially during the second half of the 20th century, many influential books were published on the topic. And most of them were concerned with materials and techniques, functional evaluations, and formal descriptions, which roughly correspond, as Clary Polivu often reminded us, to the classic Vitruvian triad of firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. So it is, in a way, a classic understanding of what built space is and how it should be approached. Since the beginning of the 20th century, some of the sites that have been excavated very early on kept on being excavating, or new projects were opened in these sites. Means that we have a very broad range of settlements of different types. New projects have also been opened, and they produced quite fascinating buildings. Many regions of the islands have been systematically surveyed now, and we have a very rich data set to work on. And consequently, at the beginning of the 21st century, key publications were also made available on Minoan urbanism and architecture, and you have a few of these on the screen, and this is, of course, without counting paper in journal, festschrift, and so on. So nowadays, very few people will argue against the fact that Minoan architecture is very distinctive. And very few people would contest that Minoan Crete saw the first development of urban center during the Bronze Age in the limits of contemporary Europe. But our understanding of these towns and buildings is now challenged by a turn in Minoan studies. Since the beginning of the 21st century, Minoan scholars are more and more aware of the legacy of the 20th century origin of our discipline, and they put forward limitations and biases that weigh on the interpretations that we made for several years. And these are landmark volumes that were concerned with that. And if you pay attention to the lexical field of the subtitles of these volumes, you'll see that it's really clear. We rethink, we revisit, we reassess, it's always the same. So in these volumes, the main focus is really on debates on the socio-political organization of Minoan Crete. And it is certain that the traditional views have been challenged and new interpretive frameworks have been provided. But more importantly for our workshop, this shift, this turn in Minoan studies has also triggered a very innovative research perspective in architectural and urban studies. And these innovative research perspectives distinguish themselves in four different but complementary ways. First, we have much more regional approaches than before. And these regional approaches made clear that there were a lot of local variations. And this contributed to downplay a monolithic narrative that was very often applied to the whole island. Of course, most of the surveys that you can find on this map were conducted in the 20th century, but some of them were only published quite recently. And some surveys are still going on. And most importantly, the Kenosis Urban Landscape Project, which is an intensive survey of the Kenosis Valley, it was conducted in, as you can see on the slide, 05, 07, and 08. And the material that was produced during these survey seasons is now under study. But these fine-grained analyses at the local scale were also reinforced by a diachronic focus. It means that instead of a strict division in developmental stages that we tend to use before, people pay now more attention to patterns of continuity and change. And it applies to studies that are concerned with settlement dynamics, as it is the case in this study with the beginning of urbanization by Todd Whitelow. But it's also the case of studies that are interested in the interplays between tradition and innovation in architecture. In that example, it is more specifically the existence of prototypes of Lustral Basin and Minoan Hall in the Quartier Mu at Malia, whether one, as Joe showed, is interested in forms, materials, and techniques, or in spatial configuration, access, and visual analysis. There is also a much deeper understanding of the importance of the multiscalar nature of the built environment. And in a book that he recently published, Knappett has been a strong advocate of paying attention to the interactions between these different organizational levels, between the micro scale of buildings, households, and proximate interactions, the mesoscale of settlements and communities of practices, and the macro scale of the island-wide spatial organization, polities, and regional interactions. Of course, a lot of work remains to be done in that regard, especially if we want to trace these interactions effectively. And last but not least, in recent years, many scholars have adopted analytical tools and techniques and methods that are usually borrowed from urban studies and complexity sciences. And these methods have been applied at different scale of the built environment. Very quickly, this is an example of previous work by Eleftheria Paliou. It's in the West House in Akrotiri, and more specifically, room 5. and she was studying visibility of the friezes in room 5 from the square of the procession. But such methods were also used to simulate settlement patterns and model flows of interactions between them. Here it's a recent paper by Andrew Bevan and Alan Wilson, but also questioning interaction at a much wider scale with the network analysis of Evans, Rivers, and Knappett. So generally speaking, these 4 characteristics, so the regional approaches and local variations, the diachronic focus, the multiscalar approaches, and the analytical tools and methods certainly contributed to strongly improve our understanding of the Minoan built environment. But these studies are either usually confined to a limited number of sites, or scholars that are the advocates of these new methods or new approaches usually work in relative isolation from one another. So that's the reason why Cal and I believed that it was timely to organize this workshop to foster the pooling of these new studies and to also foster a critical assessment of the new perspective that they open. And to get to that goal, we wanted to invite the advocates of these new approaches, in other words, you, to see how we can integrate these perspectives more effectively and potentially to apply them to a wider range of evidence. To do that, we invited the speakers to think about Minoan buildings and urban settlements rather as dynamic processes rather than static products. And what does that mean exactly? It means paying a little bit more attention to the active potential of Minoan built space, or as Edward Soya would say, to write Minoan society spatially. It's not about giving an absolute primacy to the spatial. It is about paying attention to the spatiality of Minoan life. And of course, nothing is really new about that. It's really influenced by the spatial turn that was initiated some 25 years ago in human geography and had a huge impact in many disciplines ever since. And the basic idea of the spatial turn is that space is indeed more than the backdrop of human action, but it's also much more than the simple materialization of social norms. There exist between space and society relationships of mutual influences that we have to try to understand in their full complexity. Recently, this spatial turn was, one could say, reinforced by an urban turn, what Michael Batty recently called a new science of cities. Nowadays, with the technologies that we have, we can record a lot more information and a huge amount of data on land use, rates of socioeconomic activities, energy and pollution, infrastructures, and so on and so on. And such big data, as they're called, are mobilized to model and to try to question the dynamics of social, spatial, and infrastructural networks that form cities, but also the sets of actions, interactions, and transactions that make urban environment function or dysfunction, socially, economically, or ecologically. And recently, Louis Betancourt has said that cities can be conceived as social reactors. In other words, social interactions and outputs in cities, whether they are negative or positive, increase at a much faster rate than the increase in population. And of course, as our keynote speaker, Michael Smith, recently wrote on his blog, we're not sure that this scaling law can apply to ancient built environment. It needs to be tested, and it's not even sure that we have the data sets to do this. But one thing is sure, this idea of cities as social reactors was already in the air for many years. And it is actually quite close what Jane Jacobs called the agglomeration economy, or what Edward Soya called the stimulus of urban aggregation. In other words, towns and cities, now and in history, make a difference. They catalyze behaviors that are either good or bad, up to a degree that was not matched before. But how exactly does this idea of an active potential, let's say, of space, buildings, and towns, can actually help us to understand ancient built environment, and more specifically, Minoan towns and buildings? We believe that this perspective can be used exploratory and explanatory. By creating a sense of buildings and towns doing something, making a difference, this strongly invites us to mobilize our static data, the remains of buildings and settlements, into a more dynamic framework. In other words, it invites us to go from the hard infrastructure of built space, and of course we know that built environments are complex realities that cannot be reduced to their physical remains, but that's basically what we have, physical remains. So this perspective could help us to go from hard infrastructures to what Charles Landry called soft infrastructures, which are the communicative and interactive networks that these hard infrastructure host and frame. Presumably, this is what we all try to do, in a way. And to finish this introduction, I will give you some of the limitations that, in my opinion, prevent us from doing it efficiently up to this point. But just before that, I'll give you a quick example of what I mean by tracing soft infrastructures. This is a small space syntax application on the street layout of Neopalatial Palagastro. It's based on the work that Tim Cunningham did some 14 years ago. And the idea is to try to understand how buildings, street, and open spaces relate to one another, and the fact that they form particular kind of spatial configurations, and try to understand how these spatial configurations create opportunities for movement, occupation, and interactions between people. And what you can see to the left of the screen, the right for you, I guess, the street segments are colored. The more a street segment is close to red, the more it will tend to attract pedestrian movement. The closer it is to blue, the lowest its potential to attract pedestrian movement will be. So you have a scale, in other words, from busy street to quiet street. And this is, of course, a very basic and first level of analysis. And then you can start combining that with other information. I'm not sure that you can see them very clearly, but you have arrows in the buildings. They indicate the placement of doorways. So you can start questioning the fact, if a street is potentially a very busy street, does that imply a particular location of doors around that street? And then you can start combining that with visual analysis. If you start analyzing the view sheds of different doors, you can start questioning that as well. But you could also use space syntax to model hypotheses. In this case, to the right of the screen, you have the Neopalatial street layout of Gournia, as it stands today, roughly. And just to test an hypothesis, I extended the East Ridge Road and the East Assen Sea towards the public court, and the suggestion, I'm not sure that the pointer is working. This was actually suggested by Jan Driessen in Trouble Island. And if you do that, you see that the public court potentially attracts much more pedestrian movement than it would without these two connections. Of course, it's just an hypothesis, just to show you. So most of us would argue that up till now, Minoan built environments have already been studied in terms of dynamic processes, and we do have the tools to do that. But I think that we have limitations today that prevent us to really bring that approach forward. And one of the other goals of this workshop is to discuss these limitations and to see if we could think about ways to overcome these limitations. And there are probably many limitations. I'll only talk about two of them: data collection and data description. So the first problem is data collection. And as archaeologists, we all know that our data sets is fragmentary. And the level of fragmentation of the data we have is really broad in Minoan Crete. It can go from like house A in Akladia, you barely see the walls, actually just have the outlines. And then you have like the dream of all our archaeologists, like Sector Delta in Akrotiri, where buildings are preserved on more than one floor. But on top of that, the degree of data collection varies a lot, from almost non-existent to the first excavation at the beginning of the 20th century to really detailed for new projects. And it means that our data sets are actually quite difficult to compare. It means that one thing we should do as well, and I would like to thank Todd Whitelaw for that suggestion, we should think about what sort of evidence we could document in similar ways and what type of data we could salvage from older excavation to be able to work on these comparisons, whether allow inter-periods or inter-sites. And this work is actually done today. This is what John McEnroe and Matthew Buell are doing at Gournia. This is also what Maud de Volder is doing on the palace at Malia. But I'm afraid that data collection is not the main issue. In my opinion, data description is the issue. If our goal is to study buildings and urban environments as dynamic processes, we need to be able to describe and present our data in ways that enable such a research perspective. To give you a very short example, in her recent book, Construire en Crète, Minoan, Maud de Volder was working on trying to understand the investment of labor in terms of working hours for the completion of various building activities. And she wouldn't have been able to do that if she didn't have detailed descriptions of types of materials, the measures of preserved structures, construction phases, and so on and so on. This is quite obvious. So in a way, we could say, especially for the recent excavations like Comos, Psira, or Mokros, that we do have detailed description. So the problem is not so much in the details. The problem is, in my opinion, in standardization. It is because these data are not described the same way in different sites that we're not able to mobilize them in comparative studies. And when we do have comparative studies, usually what they gain in scope, they lack in precision. So to finish today, I'll just give you a few open suggestions about how we could possibly make it a little bit more standardized. One thing is that, again, apart from like recent excavation, we don't have good phase plans. Almost none of them. Comos is a good exception. This is a good phase plan of the House of the Snake Tube, for example. Really detailed, so you can really work on that, work on the evolution of the house. One thing we could do for that is maybe pay a little bit more attention to wall typology. We have very good wall typologies in elevation, most notably by John McEnroe and Joe Shaw, but we have almost nothing in plan. There is in 1986 a very good paper by Walsh and MacDonald in Journal of Field Archaeology who actually made a methodology to do that. And this is just a small test that I did on building CD at CC. But to make sure that we can use wall plan as a diagnostic tool, all of us would need to do that, and then we should start comparing between sites to see if we can really use that as a good diagnostic tool. I mean, beyond the fact that we all know that in the Neopalatial period they were building walls in a very specific fashion, but it's more complex than that. Something that we could also pay a little bit more attention to is what is called typo morphology in urban studies. It's the detailed description of a whole range of spatial forms and their properties, that's the morphology part, and the subsequent identification of common characteristics and recurrent patterns across them, that's the typology part. And this is a very simple example. I just took a little part of Gournia, a little part of Palais-Castro, and I colored in different colors houses within blocks. And as you can see immediately, the size of the houses varies a lot in Palais-Castro, but not so much in Gournia. So this is a very basic application of typomorphology, of course. But then you can start making it a little bit more complex and use more accurate density measures, for example. And using good density measures is probably a good way to start talking about the type of social group that is associated with these houses. And it's a bit of a hotly debated topic nowadays. And I hope we'll have the occasion to talk about that. Another thing that we could do, and this is something that is very dear to me, this is what I'm working on, is paying a little bit more attention to spatial structure, which is the ways in which spaces are organized and in connection with one another, the type of spatial configurations that they form within buildings, and how these configurations evolve through time. It's what I recently called syntactical genealogy. Just to show you a quick example, these are two pre-palatial buildings, Kamesi and Ayafotias. And what is intriguing is that the spatial configuration of these buildings, so the way spaces are organized, and the visual properties that these buildings have, is very similar to that of the later palaces. They both have a central court, highly visible, highly controllable visually, and that it's really at the core of all the circulations within the building. I guess my final point is that if we do have these detailed and standardized description, this is the firm foundations we need to start talking about human behaviors and practices across different scales and in relation with Minoan architecture and built environments. And to do that, we could start applying what our keynote speaker, Michael Smith, recently called empirical urban theories, which are a set of concepts and methods that, and I quote, all deal with both the impact of humans on the built environment, processes of design, construction, modification, and destruction, and the impact of the built environment on the action, social organization, and mental states of people. And this is what I meant when I said that we should start writing Minoan society spatially. And if we do that, and if we, with like detailed and standardized description, we adopt this shift from static data to dynamic processes, we might eventually readdress a few questions that we've been dealing with so far. We could start refining our understanding of how the progressive development of urban infrastructures might have contributed to trigger and ultimately sustain particular dynamics, such as innovative behaviors, competitive emulation, the increased flow in the exchange of goods. But we could also start critically readdressing crucial issues of socio-political organization, diachronically, regionally, and at different scales. And one thing that we have to keep in mind is that outside of EGN archaeology, our very rich data set is barely used. And if we start describing it the right way, we could start aligning studies of Minoan built environments with ongoing comparative analysis of the urban phenomenon. And we will hear a lot about that in our keynote address tonight. And these studies have shown that there's a high variability in towns and cities throughout the age, and that this long-term perspective and worldwide perspective can give to scholars and policymakers today insights to face modern issues that contemporary cities are concerned with. Of course, all of these questions are very broad issues that are way beyond the scope of these two-day workshop, but we do hope that the talks, the papers, and the discussions that we'll be having in the next 2 days will be a decisive step towards these goals. Thank you for your attention.